The most significant event of this week was the ECB's surprise 75 basis point rate hike. The expectation was for a 50 basis point hike. Interest rates in the Eurozone are now at 1.25%. Now, of course, that's still a very low rate, especially in the face of 9.5% or so year-over-year inflation, which is where they are in the Eurozone as of August. In fact, Eurozone inflation is now higher, at least the way they measure it with their CPI, than it is in the U.S. And one of the main reasons for that has been the weakness in the euro relative to the U.S. dollar. In fact, the euro, again, for a good part of this week, trading below parity with the U.S. dollar, though it did rise towards the end of the week, settling back above parity. But the weakness in the euro in relation to the dollar is one of the reasons that Eurozone inflation is as high as it is. It's also one of the reasons that U.S. inflation isn't even higher, because while the Eurozone has had to deal with the problem of a weak euro making their inflation stronger, America has had the benefit of a strong dollar making our inflation weaker. So as bad as our inflation has been, think about how much worse it would have been had the dollar been weak as opposed to strong, at least relative to other currencies. But I also think more importantly than the fact that the ECB decided to be more aggressive than what the markets had expected was the tone of the press conference that followed. And if you listen closely to what Lagarde was saying, she is now very much in the inflation fighting camp. Her rhetoric is very similar to Jerome Powell's rhetoric in how committed the ECB is to fighting inflation and to bringing inflation back down to their 2% target. Now, first of all, I think the 2% target in and of itself represents a slight change in ECB policy, which I do not think is insignificant, because if you recall, when inflation was still below 2%, at least officially, what the ECB said, and if you go back to all these Mario Draghi press conferences, Mario Draghi always claimed that the goal of the ECB was to get inflation to be close to, but below 2%, meaning 2% was too high. They needed to be below 2%, but they had to get as close to 2% as possible without touching it. Now, of course, that whole policy made no sense, and nobody questioned it. I never heard a single person at a press conference talk about how ridiculous such a policy was and to ask Mario Draghi to explain it. After all, why is 1.9% inflation great, but 2% is a disaster, and so is 1.8? I mean, what is the magical number that makes 1.9 the sweet spot? Or maybe is it 1.99? Maybe 1.9 is still too low because you can still get closer to 2% without touching it. Now, this nonsensical policy was all about trying to come up with an excuse to continue easy money so that politicians in the Eurozone didn't have to face reality, so that they didn't have to cut government spending or act responsibly. That's really what the ECB was trying to do. It was trying to bail out European politicians by allowing them to continue to deficit spend, to continue to buy votes with borrowed money, and to make it work, the ECB had to keep borrowed money super cheap. So they came up with this ridiculous theory that because inflation was still not quite close enough to 2%, they needed negative interest rates. They needed quantitative easing. But the whole 2% number was originally conceived of as a ceiling. The whole idea was to keep inflation below 2%. Not get as close to 2% as you can, just make sure you're below 2%. Because it makes no sense to try to get close to it. If inflation is 1%, why is that a problem? Why is it so important that it be 1.9%? But it wasn't just 1%. It was 1.5, 1.6, and Mario Draghi was saying, that's not enough. We have to work extra hard. We need to keep cranking out money. We need to keep interest rates negative and expand our balance sheet. because we got to get closer to 2%. And one of the things I pointed out in real time as being part of the lunacy of this policy, I said, hey, what happens if they overshoot 2%? What happens if they get to 2.5 or 3 or 4? Now what? What kind of draconian monetary policy is going to be required to bring inflation back below 2%, considering how aggressive they had to be to get inflation up to 2%? Imagine how much more aggressive they'd have to be on the other side to get it back down if it was way above. After all, they were trying to move the needle just slightly from 1.5 to 1.9. Well, what happens if they have to move the needle from a higher number? And now the ECB has to move that needle from 9.5 all the way down to 2. And if it was so difficult to get it up to 2 from just below, imagine how much more difficult it's going to be to get it all the way back down from 9.5 to 2. And what type of political pain are Europeans going to have to endure as a consequence of this? Would it really been so bad if the ECB just left well enough alone and just accepted a 1.5 or 1.6% inflation? Did they really have to flood the Eurozone with so much cheap money that now we have a massive inflation problem that is almost impossible to contain? And we're about to find out just how much pain Europe is going to have to endure to bring inflation back down to 2%, because Christine Lagarde is saying that come hell or high water, that is exactly what the ECB is going to do. Now, they've given up the idea of being below 2%. Now they want to be exactly at 2%. Well, they've got a long way to go. And in fact, the rate hike from Thursday barely brings them any closer to their goal. Because if you have 9.5% inflation and you got 1.25% interest rates, are you anywhere near fighting inflation? No. And in fact, Lagarde herself in the Q&A admitted that the policy rate, even after the rate hike, was still accommodative. Lagarde admitted that the ECB is still stimulating the Eurozone economy with its low interest rates. Well, if inflation is the problem and you're committed to solving it, why are you deliberately making it worse? If you know you have a stimulative monetary policy in the face of much too high inflation, and Lagarde continuously described inflation as being much too high, not a little too high, but much too high. It is a major threat. And if you acknowledge the size of that threat, why do you continue to fuel the fire? If Lagarde was really serious about fighting inflation, she would have raised interest rates a lot more than 75 basis points. Now, she claimed that this was front-loading the rate hikes. Not really. You're not loading up anything when you've got 9.5% inflation and you're raising rates to 1.25. Now, I think the reason that they did 75 basis points and not 50 basis points was just they wanted to do more than the markets expected, but by as little as possible. So they tacked on an extra 25 basis points. In fact, one of the questions that Lagarde got was, how did they choose 75 basis points? Why not 50? Why not 100? And there is no real reason, because even 100 would be too little. I think all they were trying to do is send a message that they were tough, so they tried to deliver that message by delivering a rate hike that exceeded expectations, even though a 100 basis point hike would still not be enough to do the job. And again, Lagarde admitted that, and in fact, at one point in the Q&A, she said that we're still a long way away from an interest rate that would be high enough to bring inflation back down to 2%. Now, she never really defined what rate is needed. There were several questions about the terminal rate, right? How high do you think interest rates are going to have to go? And she refused to answer that question because, of course, she doesn't want to answer that question because A, she doesn't really know, but B, I think she knows the rate is much higher than what it is right now. And she doesn't want to say that rate because it would scare the hell out of the markets to have to contemplate rates going that high. Later on, in answer to the same question, somebody said, how many more meetings do you think we need to get to where you want to be? Because she kept reiterating the fact that we need to get to interest rates that are consistent with returning inflation to our 2% goal. And she said, well, I don't know how many meetings, but it's probably more than 2 but fewer than 5, which really narrows it down to 3 or 4, which I also think is ridiculously narrow, because I don't think there's any way that Lagarde can know for sure that in just 3 or 4 more rate hikes that will be where we need to be, because first of all, they don't even know where inflation is going to be following that 3rd or 4th rate hike. But even the hikes that they're contemplating are too little too late. And if she's correct that 1.25% is a long way from where they need to go, then they're not going to get there in just 3 or 4 meetings unless they start raising rates by a lot more than 75 basis points. But by saying she was front loading the increase in September, that implies that this was a bigger rate hike than subsequent rate hikes will be, although she did not commit to that. But of course, if all it's going to take is another 3 or 4 more hikes to get to where we need to be, then why not just raise rates to that level right now? Why do it slowly over another 3 or 4 meetings? Just move rates right now to where you think they need to be to bring inflation back down to 2%.